The following is a Live the Dream Media production.
Hello and welcome to the Faith Family Schools podcast with your host Christopher DeSimone.
All right, welcome back to the world of America's Road Back, Faith, Family, in Schools, where we believe that elections and success in elections, are temporary results, and that the long road back is the road through faith, family, and schools, and making them stronger, better, more prevalent, and helping influence another generation of Americans to bring this country back from the brink. And I am thrilled to have Matthew Beienburg here from the Goldwater Institute. Matthew is the Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute, and he also serves as the Director of the Institute's Von Sittert Center for Constitutional Advocacy. That's a hell of a business card. Matthew Beienburg, welcome to Faith Family Schools.
Thanks for having me on. Good to be with you.
So here you are. You look rather young, much younger and less ragged than I do. How does a guy like you get into educational freedom and educational policy at the Goldwater Institute?
Sure. Older than I look, but yeah, it's been a kind of a bit of a route from different areas. And I'm the Director of Education Policy at Goldwater now. Spent a few years before that working for the State Legislative Budget Office, so doing school funding, school finance for K-12, for higher education. Spent some time in graduate school before that, studying public affairs, worked in the private sector, studied economics in college. So kind of a different path of looking at, so much of what we talk about in education policy comes to, usually we hear things like, oh, what we need for our schooling system and for the kids is just to put more money into the system. A lot of the conversation comes down to funding and finance. And, at the end of the day, it's less about the inputs and more about, our kids learning. But so much of those conversations are focused on the dollars, who has control of them, how much are they, that's been a route that I've been able to focus a lot on in terms of, where are we putting those funds? Are they going to parents? Are they going to a bureaucracy? And then the content is also, hugely important about, are you teaching, basic reading? Are you teaching the Constitution? Or are you teaching an appreciation of America's fundamental founding principles?
Why is education such an important thing for you as an American citizen and a guy who lives in Arizona? Why is this important to you personally?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, there's the news cycles, even election cycles, these things come and go. But, as you mentioned, the sort of enduring long-term impacts are really something that's generational. And that starts with how kids are educated. Are they learning to be, responsible, successful members of the U.S.? Are they somebody who has those skills? And so, I had an experience back when I was in the private sector, and we were doing a volunteer day with a charter school in Los Angeles. And these were all super low income, first generation, largely Spanish speaking family students. And these kids had been failed in the public school system, the district school system. And some teachers had jumped ship and started a charter school out there, which is still a public school, but it's independent of the kind of district bureaucracy. And the kids were doing amazing. And it sort of is an example that, it's hard to see things like that firsthand and say, we shouldn't replicate that. We shouldn't try to do everything we can to provide opportunities like this where kids aren't just stuck in a system and told, yeah, we're going to keep lowering the expectations because we think that's how we're going to be, most, we see places that are taking away graduation requirements or getting rid of all these things, right? To say in the name of equity or diversity that we're going to help kids by basically lowering the bar and not expecting them to reach their potential. And I think that's an ideology that's ultimately kind of saps their opportunity. And so it's something that for me matters a lot because I do think that our kids can do better and we need to meet them at that opportunity.
So there's a show that's called The Road Back, Faith, Family, Schools. What's the road to where we got here for K-12 public schools? Where I went to a great K-12 school in New York, but it was instituted as a union-free school district, which when I tell people, they're like, that's real? They don't understand that. But explain over the last, 4 decades, how we got to this place we're at now in K-12 public.
Sure. Yeah, it's been a long road, and it's been one of a lot of ideas, a lot of extra spending, and a lot of union control, the teachers unions obviously now being an incredibly strong force. You can go back to the 1960s when the federal government first started really getting involved in education. You have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and these were grand ambitions that we're going to help equalize the funding. We're going to provide extra resources for these kids. And what we've seen is the failure of these programs, the failure of a lot of these ideologies to do anything other than make the system more expensive while holding kids back. And so, we've seen a doubling of the spending on education over the last 50 years, adjusted for inflation. So real dollars, across the US, spending double what we were. Even in Arizona since 1980, we're spending 50% more than we were, again, adjusted for inflation. It's about $5,000 more per kid than we used to spend. That's $100,000 for a classroom of 20 students. And yet our teacher pay hasn't gone up, adjusted for inflation. Our outcomes haven't gone up nationally. And so what we keep hearing, and we saw this during COVID, was what we need is more, right? More resources, more funding, put $200 billion into this. None of that addresses the underlying problems of our kids learning. And that's, to your question of what's the road been, it's been, let's just stay on the status quo. We're going to, don't worry about it. Your school may not be serving your kid really well. Your kid may be struggling, but just hang in there and don't worry about it, and keep investing in your public school in a way that just says we need more money spent, not better outcomes for kids.
Was there a golden age for education in America that we're so far away from? When was that, if there was such a thing?
Yeah, I actually say that we're on the cusp, I think, of and maybe this jumps to your question of the road back. We may be entering what could be a golden age in education. I think the pandemic was the most devastating academically, in terms of mental health outcomes, everything across the board, the worst thing to happen to our students in a generation or more. And I think the silver lining is, in the wake of all of this, what we're seeing is an explosion of parental empowerment, of students having options. And so I think, when we can talk about this, we're seeing a sort of domino effect now of all of these states that are breaking away from this bureaucratic chokehold of, yeah, here's a union dominated system, take it or leave it. We just saw in the news places like Baltimore where basically none of the kids are scoring proficient on it's appalling. You see these things and you think that it's a parody because it couldn't possibly be real, but the kids who are just being left out to dry or passed through the system and not actually taught. But I think now we're seeing a kind of a new wave where there is going to be a change, and states are now passing laws one after another to make it so that we are no longer going to be beholden to this kind of status quo, stagnant education system.
And you're referring to Baltimore. I feel it's 15 to 18 high schools in the Baltimore K-12 system have 0 students proficient at math.
Right. Yeah. And it's not a number. You can't make that up. It's just shocking. And yet that's something that is allowed to continue. And those kids are an example of, there is no excuse for a system that leaves kids in that state. And
I assume Baltimore school district are much higher capitalized per student school district than something in Arizona.
That's right. And this is actually something that's interesting. You bring that up because we usually hear this idea of, well, the schools in these areas aren't funded enough. It's the rich, neighborhoods that have more funding. In a lot of cases, you actually have some of the highest spending in some of these very disadvantaged areas. And yet parents are still fleeing and trying desperately to get out of those schools because they're not serving the kids. You can pour all the money you want into it, but if it's a dysfunctional administration, it's a dysfunctional school culture, they're not, empowering the teachers to maintain control of the classroom. We see things like these pushes for restorative justice where they say, we're going to do this idea of room clearing. If there's a kid who's acting out of control, instead of disciplining that student, we're going to have everybody else get out of the classroom and leave and give that child some time to sort of calm down. It's these completely backwards.
I've never heard of room clearing, and I'm scared to death of it.
Yeah, again, it's one of these things that it's kind of hard to believe, but it's this idea again of, we've got these great notions of how we can improve equity and improve the well-being of students, and yet it undermines the learning environment of the kids. So it's again just part of the same broader issue of, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. A lot of stuff like this that may sound nice to somebody in a Ivy League, classroom somewhere. And then when rubber meets the road, what you're having are kids having their education disrupted day in and day out. And then you end up with something like what we have in Baltimore.
So you and I are in the state of Arizona, which was one of the leaders in what we call educational freedom. And we know that the COVID lockdowns and the silliness of online learning for 42nd graders and all of this is this the great awakening, this moment for a lot of the parents in America?
I think it was. We had so many who were used to I'm going to drop my kid off. I'm going to come home. They'll come home and they can, say what you do in school today. And suddenly finding that you have teachers and unions and everybody out protesting, saying that it's racist or oppressive to reopen the schools, sending fake obituaries and making tombstones, all sorts of stuff to say we couldn't possibly open our schools. And parents obviously were left holding the bag in a lot of these cases. Many took to then becoming de facto homeschool instructors for their kids. A lot saw, on Zoom, the content that was being taught, trying to basically indoctrinate or radicalize kids with, radical gender theory or CRT. And parents saw that and said, hold on, there's a problem here. And so now I think that gave a lot of the impetus to the momentum we're seeing now around education freedom and school choice.
Define educational freedom for the rookies out there, Matthew.
Sure. Basically, it says that a student's educational opportunity shouldn't be dictated based upon their zip code, that any kid should have the opportunity to pursue the best educational environment for them, regardless of what that looks like. And so that could be saying, look, instead of just saying your family lives in the zip code, so you're going to go to this district school, you can have access to go to a different school district, or you can have access to go to a public charter school. Or now what we're seeing is states saying, actually, we're going to take a piece of what we would have spent on your kid to send them to a public school, and we're going to deposit that with the family, and they can use that to put that toward private school tuition if they want, or tutoring, or at-home curriculum materials, special education therapy, whatever that might be. So the idea of education freedom is we're prioritizing and focusing on the needs of the student, not on an individual school district or a bureaucracy or one cookie cutter mode that we think all kids have to fit into.
So in Arizona, as we started the journey, at least 20 years ago, we started was open enrollment, that you can go to any public school. Was that the first kind of stone to roll on this?
Yeah, open enrollment and charter schools both kind of grew up a little over about 30 years ago. And that idea is, yes, you're still in a public system, but we are going to give you the opportunity to go from, if you're in Scottsdale Unified School District and you want to go to Cave Creek or Paradise Valley, or you want to go from Tempe to Scottsdale, you can do that. Or you can enroll in a public charter school, which again is a public school, but independently operated. So they're not sort of beholden to the teachers unions in the same way. They don't have to hire teachers only who have gone through these teacher prep programs that are overwhelmingly politically radicalized, and also for decades have pushed instruction around reading that has been shown to be extremely damaging to kids. We actually just saw the Columbia Teachers College, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country, has had to abandon the reading prep essentially that they did for decades, because it's been increasingly shown that instead of teaching kids phonics and how to actually decode words and read, that it essentially was pushing things like just guessing randomly at words based upon pictures. And so the charter schools have been free not to have to rely on just the people who have gone through these systems that are supposedly, accredited or have the stamp of approval, but saying we're going to hire the best teachers. Maybe they haven't gone through a teacher prep program, but they were a brilliant engineer or scientist or accountant or doctor, whatever it may be. And so they're people who actually know the subject matter and can, teach kids, as opposed to someone who just clocked in several years at a teacher prep program and again learned stuff about restorative justice and DEI and that sort of stuff.
So when you and I met in person last November, we were at the Goldwater Heritage Foundation Educational Freedom Conference, because we were celebrating Arizona as pretty much the possible leader in this. But I remember one of those smart people like yourself, I wasn't sure if it was you or one of your Heritage compatriots. I think it was one of your Heritage. They showed that map. I think it was the state of Ohio. And they talked about how here's educational freedom started here, and it started to increase, but then it started bringing up the performance of the K-12 public schools. Is this something that we usually see when educational freedom is, I guess, expanded in a state?
Yeah, it is, and it's a good question because the charge from opponents is, well, you're going to take all the engaged families or the more privileged families, and you're going to leave everybody else behind, and you're going to destroy the system. Actually, the research that's out there is showing this is something that not only helps the kids who take advantage of those programs, but actually the kids who remain in the public school system also tend to do better. And it's not that hard to explain why, right? If the public school is the only game in town, there's no pressure on them to make sure they're delivering a great education to kids. But if they want to keep kids in seats because their funding is tied to their enrollment, suddenly they have an incentive to make sure they're offering the best they can. I've actually had a conversation with one of the former superintendents of a big Arizona school district. And he said, yeah, the charter schools, when they came on, it made us up our game. Like they knew they had to start competing with the charter schools. And so exactly to your point, it's, if you want to take advantage of the school choice option, that's fantastic. If you don't, and you want to stay in the public school, the public district school system, well, now you've got a system that's incentivized to at least a little better start to try to make sure that they're competing and offering a good education.
Has there any been research done that shows what's the pain point for enrollment decline or things in a public school that they finally go, oh, we're going to start getting better? What's that look like where, Tucson Unified School District, which is one of the worst in the state here in Tucson, they went from 67 to 70,000 kids. Now they're down to like 30 something thousand kids. They're getting a little better, but not much. What's the pain point we're seeing out there?
Yeah, there's not really one in particular inflection point. You mentioned Tucson, where they have a huge share of their kids go elsewhere. Then you have, Vail right next door, where there's almost no charter schools. Everybody is almost, there's just not the demand for other options because the school district there is high functioning. It works really well. But to your point about what point does it get their attention? I don't know that there's a single, point. We see some who are more responsive and some who are less. The Roosevelt Elementary School District in Phoenix here, which is, been one of the worst performing school districts in the city. And it's in an area of 90%, Hispanic and Black students. Its child poverty rate is very high. This is a very disadvantaged school district. And what we've seen is over half the kids in that district have fled. They have gone to other schools, other public schools, even setting aside how one feels about, private school choice, et cetera. Yep. But you've had thousands of kids who have left that school district to go to other public schools. And so even then, what we're seeing is this district has an incentive to serve, or else it's going to continue losing kids. You have some of these districts who just sort of stubbornly stay on the same course, but you're at least having fewer kids, stuck there, and more kids have the option to keep going. You have others who kind of take note and say, like, yeah, we have to compete. So there's, it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of how the districts respond. Some of which, the kids recognize, hey, we've had parents go testify to the legislature from places like Roosevelt and say, I wasn't going to wait 10 years for you to tell me you're going to improve my school system. Like my family can't afford to move to a more expensive zip code. My kids need a good education. I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to take them to the district on the other side of town, or I'm going to send them to a private school if there's, options around that as well.
So there's people listening, we hope, from all over the country. And they're not in a state that's as free as Arizona when it comes to education. So what's the Matt Beienburg commandments, or at least things that should be in place in each state, the basics to have that educational freedom? What would you, cause I want these people to go back to their state and go, do I have this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the easiest one is that public school open enrollment. And most states have that, but in a lot of states, it's optional. So the school districts have the choice as to whether or not they essentially want to let kids out of their district and go somewhere else. That's a no-brainer in my mind.
Semi-freedom.
Yeah. So that's one that, because there's a lot of arguments of people who just fundamentally don't like private education, or the notion that maybe families could choose a religious education, right? There are people who just, for various reasons, are opposed to families even having the choice to do a faith-based education if that's what they want to do. But at the end of the day, it also kind of exposes their hypocrisy here, because then they'll turn around and oppose even this, public school open enrollment process. So that's an easy one, is to say, yes, this should be universal. Every kid should be able to do it. Making sure that charter schools are available and open. Again, most states have charter schools, but some have either caps on the number that can be opened, or put other restrictions on that. So that's the second one. Again, that's kind of following the path of Arizona. It's in these sort of, the easiest lift is allow you to go to any district. Then it's allow you to go to a school it's still a public school, but it's operated outside of the district. And then where we are now, which is what I think is where a lot of the energy is to say it shouldn't even be constraining the choice only to a public school, right? The state of Arizona, or any state, the interest isn't in propping up a public system of education. It's ensuring that kids are educated well. And that's fundamentally a distinction where the teachers union and the folks on that side essentially want the priority to be and the focus on that system of education, as opposed to saying we're essentially ambivalent in terms of who provides the education to a student. We want to make sure that they are supported and have the opportunities. But at the end of the day, if a kid can get a better education going to a private or at-home environment, 100% let's do that, as opposed to sticking them in something that the state is operating probably at a higher cost and less efficiently and with less success academically.
I always see, and I was the pain in the butt at that meeting last November, I'm always asking, how are we educating the ignorant parents out there of their options? I feel like this is still one of our biggest challenges, correct?
It is. And this is a challenge where the teachers union, has all of the, it's essentially a free network of millions of public school employees, right? There's the institutional organizational backing. Parents are not organized in that same way, right? Your moms and dads who are out there don't all belong to the same employer. You don't have a giant school district employing all the parents. And so it's more difficult to organize and get information out to them. But we are now seeing that with a lot of these groups. We have many here in Arizona and throughout the country now that have popped up to say, hey, we're going to help, rally parents. Some of these are organized. You have groups like Moms for Liberty that have come together and said, hey,
Sure.
We're going to focus on the fact that a lot of the stuff that's being taught to our kids is garbage. It's junk, and then they get attacked and told you're banning books because you don't want some highly sexual, explicit material read to kids. And when people actually see what's going on, people support, these parents and the idea of, hey, we think that you should be able to pursue an education that works well. We don't think that you should have a bunch of stuff stuck in front of your kid that really isn't age appropriate.
I always love those videos where the parent reads the book from the school library at the school board, and then they're getting thrown out of the meeting.
That's
like
right.
The best viral video ever.
Yeah, it's apparently okay to read to the kids, but not to the adults in public.
Let's talk about this. No matter how many people take advantage of these educational freedom avenues, there's still going to be a lot of kids stuck in good to crappy K-12 schools. So if Matt was dictator of a state and you were going to write out, here are some rules that K-12 need to adhere to make it better for the kids who are stuck in K-12s that aren't that great, what would that be?
Yeah. So one of the big things that we're promoting is this idea of academic transparency, to say we think that a government-operated, a state-operated public school should be clear about the materials that they're using. They should disclose those to parents, to the public, to school board members, because what we've seen is actually a lot of the content that goes into the classroom is stuff that's pulled off of Google, it's pulled off of YouTube, it's pulled off of Pinterest, or Teachers Pay Teachers, right? It's a lot of stuff because teachers, despite all the spending by these districts on fancy curriculum, they're sending millions of dollars to, the big publishing companies, most of which are very much on the left, pushing, woke kind of content. But the schools are dumping all these resources into these curriculum, and yet the teachers still walk in the door and are spending hours just trying to essentially figure out what to use to teach the kids in the classroom because they're not getting the support. And so we've said, look, we should be doing something that empowers parents and teachers at the same time. Let's make sure the parents know what's being taught so that they can, engage with the learning of their kids and be comfortable and know, hey, is this a school that's actually pushing academics? Are they pushing kind of activism? But also that'll let teachers see what other teachers are doing so they can replicate that instead of, spending hours on Google. So that's one thing that we have promoted that, we said, look, this is a win-win across the board. We also support, if you look at the scores for student proficiency and things like U.S. history and civics, right? And it's, 1 in 5 students or less that are proficient in these fields. And so we've said, look, there's policies out there that we support to strengthen the standards that public schools are actually supposed to teach around U.S. history, for instance. So there's a group that National Association of Scholars put out, the American Birthright State Standards, essentially says, hey, we're going to go through here And states can adopt this, and it's going to say, this is a rigorous set of information that we think our kids should actually be taught and know going through the public school system, rather than, having U.S. history or civics instruction push these ideas of, well, we actually care more that the kids are going to come out and just vote, or that they're going to go get involved in some campaign or some social justice activism. So we've said, look, if this is we're all for student and school choice, but if it's a government operated school, that's the state basically dictating what is taught. And we think that what is taught should be, returning to the founding principles of the country, to make sure that our kids are actually learning an appreciation of the liberties that we have, of the way that our government works and why it works that way and why it's important.
So we've talked American history proficiency and also math. What scares me to death is illiteracy and reading proficiency. We know that across the country, our K through 3 reading is abysmal. And I know they say, well, if your parents read and you model it, you'll read. And I have someone who teaches literacy here, and she's like, I have to treat all my kids like they're orphans. Whether they have kids or parents or not who read, we have to start there. But talk about the problem with literacy, because information's so available more than ever, right? And free. You can get yourself a college education online without a diploma, really. But I have more and more people who can't read with proficiency.
Yeah, and absolutely right. If you can't read at basic literacy, everything's going to flow from that. And I kind of touched on this a little earlier about the Teachers College. So we've actually, for decades, you have had a huge share of public schools using these materials, things called balanced literacy or whole language, that literally rejected the idea of phonics. They said, we don't want to do this drill and kill and have kids spend time and learn the sounds. No, we want them to be engaged readers and to be stimulated and to be excited. And so they basically give them books where they're filled with pictures, and the kids essentially memorize just, learning what the short sentences on the page, they can get through it. Then when they start getting to books that don't have pictures, it's very clear they have not learned how to read. And so for decades, the most prestigious institutions, the ones that are feeding all of the public schooling, the folks that are at the heart of the curriculum, the publishing companies, has been pushing content that has actively damaged the reading instruction. Just recently, we've actually seen over the last several years now, states come out and say, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to embrace what's been called the science of reading, phonics, right? Instruction that's evidence-based, that says this actually has been shown to improve learning. And what's shocking is even the states now are starting to push legislation, the teachers' unions are opposing it. They're coming out and saying, well, we support good strategies of reading, but we really want you to treat our teachers as professionals, and you shouldn't be telling us what to do. So their pushback against even basic guardrails, basic expectations of saying, there is nothing more important that you can teach these young kids than how to read, and yet you're going to insist that we not direct you, a state government operated school, to using the best tools that we have. They literally oppose this. And so they're on the losing side of this. I think we're going to continue to see more movement toward the science of reading. But it really is shocking that the teachers unions and some of these groups have just been resistant to the idea of, admit it, you were wrong. This has been destructive for kids. Doesn't matter if you were trained in this. It didn't work. It doesn't work. We need something that does work. And that's where we see a lot of really successful models, especially in the charter sector, where they are using things like the core knowledge curriculum. They're using these resources that actually teach kids what they need. And unsurprisingly, those do really well. They do well for middle income, upper income kids. They do well for low income kids, for, minority students, whatever disadvantaged background you're coming from. You actually can still reach these kids, but not if you're teaching something that actively sabotages their ability to learn how to read.
My thing with teachers union, they got to be the worst union in the world, right? Their people are paid like crap. They work in sometimes very dangerous situations with no one there to help them. And I don't understand what the success for the teachers and the parent, what is the benefit for anybody for being in a union? I don't get it.
Well, I would say they're actually incredibly successful unions because what they do, and again, I mentioned
Not
the
for their
teacher pay.
members.
Teacher pay. Well, this is the difference. The teacher pay has not gone up. They are not successful at improving the well-being for the members, but they are very successful at increasing the number of their members. So
Right.
what we have seen is huge growth in the staffing levels of folks, because the unions are not just teachers. They're any employee with public schooling. You tend to see that. So the more members, the more dues that are paid, the more political influence and the more clout that they have. We see every year the teachers unions have these big national conferences and they come out and say, here's our new list of priorities. We're going to support CRT. They explicitly say critical race theory, the 1619 Project, taking political stances on issues like abortion or foreign relations, all sorts of things that the unions, by having millions of members, has a bigger footprint on. So
it's true. And they wield it politically, because I've seen in Arizona Democrat candidates running like clean elections. They go to a union meeting with a whole bunch of teachers, get all their $5 donations and get it all done in one shot. And like, oh, thank you, teachers union. So, all right, we're running out of time. So my last question for you real quick is the wave of educational freedom growing through Arizona?
Yeah, it absolutely. It's growing through Arizona.
Through America, not Arizona. I know Arizona, sorry. Through the U.S.
Yes, and nationally. We actually just this week, the North Carolina legislature added into the budget, and it looks like it's now going to pass through here without objection from the Democratic governor, universal school choice. You've got about 10 states now with universal school choice. It went from 0 before the pandemic of universal private school choice to now about 10. And even more than that have partial systems. So we are seeing a huge wave, night and day between 5 years ago and where we are now, and certainly where we'll be 5 years from now.
All right. I always appreciate our conversations. Check out goldwaterinstitute.org to see the good work that they're doing and Matthew's doing. And Matthew, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. Matthew Beienburg, Goldwater Institute. My name's Chris DeSimone. The new podcast is Faith, Families, Schools, America's Road Back. Go to faithfamiliesschools.com to find out more and watch all of our episodes. All right, everyone have a great day. We'll see you soon. Faith, Family, and Schools.